Hello everyone, it's Coach Robert with another endgame video. Today we will be examining a situation in which one side has a far advanced pawn on the 6th rank, and they need to promote it in order to win, but there's this other bishop that's preventing them from doing this. It is often the case that there's a maneuver, which we will talk about today, that wins for the better side, but there's also a defensive stance that can hold the same position. So the result depends on whose move it is. There's also an exception in which the defending technique doesn't work, so we'll see all three of these cases. So let's start with a winning example. This one's white to play. Having the extra move helps out when white has this 6th rank pawn in the center that has to reach the end of the board. But you can't just push it, because after bishop takes d7, even though you get their bishop, it's impossible to win with just one bishop. So, that being said, we need to find some kind of clever way of chasing this bishop off of these two diagonals. The pawn needs to take that next step, so we need this bishop to be on neither of these diagonals. If they can always stay on one of them, no matter what, we will not be able to promote the pawn and win. So if you've never seen this before, you should probably pause the video and try for yourself before you see this technique. At least try for a couple of minutes. It's just a good exercise. I think the first move is relatively obvious. Well, actually maybe not, because a mistaken move that's logical is bishop e2. This move's logical because if they take your bishop, then of course you can move your pawn now. And this is probably what the very hopeful chess player would do. I always call it hope chess, when you play something where if your opponent goes along with your plan, then you win. But of course they won't cooperate. Here black has two good moves, so you might want to pause the video to see what they can do besides take this bishop. You could go either here or here. It doesn't matter. Just keep an eye on this pawn. The real MVP here is the pawn on d6. So if black is going to hold, they need to always wait for the opportunity to sacrifice their bishop for that one. So maybe it's not as obvious as I thought, but bishop d7 makes a lot of sense. It's a lot like bishop e2 in that if they take your bishop, you will win. This is a winning king and pawn endgame, because all we have to do is move the king and push that bad boy to the end of the board. And if they run away, we've taken over one of the diagonals, right? We took over this diagonal. That's great. They're not on this diagonal. So why aren't we winning? We're only not winning immediately because we have to move our bishop and give them control of the diagonal again. So we have to put this bishop somewhere so that we can advance the pawn. That's the only downside right now. So we could play bishop h3, and this is threatening this is threatening pawn d7. So they are forced to play their bishop to a4. Now you might want to pause again. This is where the puzzle really begins, in my opinion. Because this move's probably the hardest move to find in this sequence. So they are controlling the next step towards promotion. We control the other diagonal, which is great. And right now you'll notice that they have no way of getting on this diagonal without being taken, because even if we move our bishop, if they played a move onto the diagonal, that would be bishop to d7, we would just take it with the king. So we should play bishop to g2. The idea is that whatever move they play, it really doesn't matter. Like, it could be a king move, it could be a bishop move. So for example, we'll play bishop e8. After bishop c6, we control this diagonal, we control the next step for the pawn's promotion. We're threatening to take their bishop for free, and they can't move anywhere that maintains control. Like if they save their bishop like this, we are going to promote on the next move, because the promotion square is on the opposite color of this bishop. Nothing they can do. So this is a really good technique for winning the game when you have a pawn on the 6th rank and the bishops are on the same color, right? They're both light square bishops. The same technique does not work for bishops on opposite colors. That's a whole new area of discussion. So to summarize, we want to chase the bishop off of both diagonals simultaneously, and we do it with a maneuver that looks like this. We're coming back almost to where we started, but we're chasing the bishop away at each step. We chase them away. Here we're actually maneuvering towards a place where we need to chase them away. This is really a square clearance, so it's an intermediate step. So we chase them away, we clear the square, and then we prepare to intercept their bishop. And then that's it. It's done. So this seems pretty convincing. Like, white just chases their bishop a couple times, they do a square clearance, they interfere with their bishop, and then they promote to a queen and win. So then where's the defensive technique? You'll notice that I said that the maneuver involves coming back to this square. That's a very important square, because when we reach the position with the bishop on a4, the only way we can chase this bishop off of this diagonal is from either this square or this square. But if we go back to d7, we are blocking our pawn again. And so they will go somewhere like maybe here, with the idea of returning to the front of the pawn if you try to go away. Like if you try this bishop to b5, now they're back on that other diagonal. So there's really just a unique place where we can chase their bishop away, and it's c6. So imagine if black controlled c6 really well. We wouldn't have any way of making them move the bishop away from this diagonal. So we come to the same position but with the opposite colors, so our next example. And this one is black to play. So keeping in mind that we need to control the c6 square a lot to defend. Pause the video and see if you can find what black should play here. The only extra piece that can control c6 is the king, so they should play king d4. Usually it's good to avoid stepping on the color of the other bishop, but not always. So after king d4, bishop d7 is the same thing that white tried in the first example. Just as an exercise, you might want to pause here and ask yourself where the bishop should go. It should go to d1 so that we can switch to the other diagonal when they do a square clearance. So they'll clear the square with bishop h3. We take over that promotion square. That's where they need to go to get to the end of the board, so we can't ever lose control of that spot. Now when they go for bishop g2, you'll remember the idea is to interfere with this bishop. At this moment, it's key that we play king c5 in order to control this square twice. So once we've done this, they can really just try to trick us, but it's not going to work, because after bishop f3, bishop e8, we can just go back and forth. We have all these squares that we can go on. There's no way to control all of them. But this brings us to the exception, because imagine if they could control the entire diagonal. We would end up in a situation where we might be forced to move, and we won't be able to stay on the diagonal anymore, just because all the squares are under control. For example, pretend that this king, I don't know, has like a very long stick or something, and he can come over here and take on this spot. If white were to just pass the turn in such a situation, you might have to leave the diagonal because you can't go on this spot. And if you, like, let's say the white played this move, bishop to e2. I know this is like very imagination stuff, but I think exercising your imagination in chess is very useful, even though this is not like useful for the actual in-game thought process per se. So if they play the move bishop e2 and their king can control the square for some reason, it's like a super king, then if you put your bishop here, the king takes it, so that's off limits. If you put your bishop here, the king would be protecting, so when the bishop takes, that's not good. You would be running out of squares. You can't stay where you are. And the king already controls both of these because this is like some super king. So in that situation, you would have to go somewhere over here, like just somewhere on this diagonal, and then the pawn would advance. So that's all very abstract. But just to say that if white could control all five, they would be able to win the game still. So imagine if the diagonal were shorter. That's kind of the same. Either white has to be able to control the diagonal more to win, or the diagonal could be shorter. Here's a situation with a shorter diagonal. The pawn is still on the 6th rank, but this diagonal is really important, right? These are the two important diagonals. It's always the two diagonals right in front of the pawn that we care about. Obviously, white can't control this entire long diagonal with their king, but they can do it with the bishop. So we might be able to force the defending bishop to stay on this third diagonal. I mean, this 3 square diagonal. So you might want to pause here. It's white to play. Let's see how we can chase the bishop off of this diagonal, and then force them to try to defend on the short diagonal. If we can make that happen, they will have to leave that short diagonal because we control the whole thing. Sometimes it's helpful to imagine the position that you're looking for and then try to solve backwards to get to there. So let's compare the answer you came up with. After bishop c8, we're doing that same thing where we are just maneuvering to control the diagonal. Usually putting your bishop in front of the pawn is the first step for winning. So they'll probably just wait, because if they do something besides waiting, that's not good. Like if they go here, we just push the pawn. They're too slow. So waiting is the name of the game. They could wait pretty much anywhere. Now the next thing, they get chased off, and they want to move somewhere to switch diagonals, just like in the last examples. So they want to be attacking one of these 2 squares. It doesn't matter which one they choose. You should be prepared for either one, either way. So let's say they choose bishop to d3. This is saying that when this bishop goes somewhere over here, they want to go here to keep control of that square in front of the pawn. So let's say they just move away, right? This move's forced. If you didn't solve up to this point, you might want to pause again and see if you can figure out what white should do in this situation. Because if they wait on the long diagonal, black will just go back and forth between these 2 squares, just waiting to sacrifice for the pawn when it finally steps forward. So we need to find a way of making it so that black cannot toggle between these 2 squares. And that move is bishop g4. They really want to put their bishop on a square like d9, but d9 doesn't exist, so they're going to have to just move away and lose. But here's another important point. So if they move away like this, it's kind of trivial. Like, we push the pawn, wahoo. But what if they move their king instead? Because they can move their king and keep an eye on this bishop, right? Now if you move your bishop, they'll move the king, right? Not actually the case. There's a tactic here. So if you haven't spotted it already, just pause the video and think for a moment about how white can win the game after king to b5. The answer is bishop to e2. And this is just a simple skewer. We're going to take that bishop and then get a queen. So this was not really a good defensive try, but it's good to keep it in mind, especially if you're just starting out. So this is just one variation. There's one other variation where they tried to defend from f5. But this is pretty simple. It's the same idea. So we'll play a move like bishop f3, just going far away. This forces them to go on the diagonal because we were threatening to advance. And they want to toggle between these 2. So you play bishop e2 again. This way, if they go on h3, we just take it. And if they move away, we advance the pawn. So this was a winning technique for white. I'm sorry, the side with the advanced pawn just happened to be white. Could be either side. An example of a defensive technique, which involves controlling the critical square where the attacking side wants to do an interference. And then there's the exception, which is when there's a knight pawn and this diagonal is too short for the 2 of us. So I hope you like that. Feel free to drop a comment if you have anything to say about these examples. And I'll see you guys around. Good luck playing chess.